watching this video. I hope you enjoy my good stories. In a quiet town tucked between rolling fields and whispering pine trees lived a woman named Clara Monroe, whose heart had known more storms than most seas, and yet she carried herself each morning as if she still believed in sunshine. She was 43, with hands calloused by years of labor and eyes that hid a lifetime of disappointment beneath their soft brown warmth. Clara worked 2 jobs, one at the diner that smelled of burnt coffee and fried bacon, and another cleaning offices late into the night, to raise her only son, Aiden, a boy she loved more fiercely than she ever loved herself. Aiden was the reason she kept moving even when her bones ached, even when life gave her nothing but scraps. His laughter had once been her music, his dreams her direction, and every prayer she whispered at night carried his name. She had raised him alone since his father, Mark, walked out when Aiden was only 6, leaving nothing behind but unpaid bills and the faint echo of slammed doors. Clara never badmouthed him to Aiden, she just told him some people weren't built to stay. She believed in protecting her son's innocence, even if it meant swallowing her own pain. As Aiden grew, so did the distance between mother and child, not out of hatred but out of pride. Teenage years turned his heart into something she no longer recognized, sharp-edged with rebellion and restless dreams of escape. He was smart, too smart, everyone said. A scholarship student with eyes on the future and feet already halfway out the door. He wanted to go to Los Angeles, to study business, to live the life he believed his mother never could. Clara, despite her exhaustion, smiled and nodded whenever he talked about leaving, though every mention of it carved small invisible wounds inside her. She worked extra shifts to save for his dorm deposit, skipped meals to pay for his books, and told herself that love sometimes meant letting go, even when it broke you. But what she didn't know was that while she was working late nights, someone else had begun to fill the empty spaces she left behind. That someone was Evelyn, Clara's younger sister, who had moved to town 2 years earlier after a messy divorce and came to rely on Clara for support. At first, Evelyn was charming, generous, the fun aunt who brought Aiden snacks and listened to his stories. She told Clara, "Let me help. You work too hard." Clara trusted her, because family, no matter how flawed, was still family. Evelyn had always been beautiful in a way Clara never cared to be, bright lipstick, effortless laughter, a touch of vanity that drew attention. But beneath her smile hid a bitterness that had fermented over years of jealousy. She envied Clara's strength, her patience, and most of all, the love her son gave her. Evelyn had lost the affection of her own children after the divorce, and in Aiden she found both comfort and control. Slowly, she began feeding his mind with poison disguised as wisdom. "Your mom doesn't understand you," she'd say softly. "She wants you small because she's scared of losing you." Aiden, who was already wrestling with guilt about leaving her behind, found in Evelyn someone who validated his frustration. He didn't see manipulation, he saw understanding. The bond between them grew, while Clara, exhausted and unaware, thought her sister's help was a blessing. One night, Clara came home early from her cleaning shift after a pipe burst at the office. The house was quiet except for faint laughter from Aiden's room. She opened the door gently and saw Evelyn sitting on Aiden's bed, whispering something while he smiled, not a guilty smile, but one filled with trust. When Evelyn saw Clara, her tone shifted instantly, cheerful and casual. "We were just talking about college plans," she said, her voice sweet like honey laced with glass. Clara smiled, but her stomach tightened. Something in Evelyn's eyes felt wrong, too sharp, too calculating. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. The next morning, she told herself she was overthinking. After all, Evelyn was family, and suspicion was a sin against love. But days turned into weeks, and she began to notice subtle changes: Aiden avoiding her questions, hiding his phone, spending longer hours at the library. One evening she checked his room to fold laundry and found a crumpled envelope under his pillow. It was a letter of intent from a private university in California, one far more expensive than the one they had agreed on. The tuition was triple what she could ever afford. When she asked him about it that night, Aiden snapped, "It's my life, Mom. I'm tired of living small just because you did." The words cut deeper than any knife, not for their meaning but for their cruelty. Clara sat in silence, watching the boy she raised speak like a stranger. Evelyn stood behind him in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, a faint smirk flickering before she turned away. That night, Clara cried quietly at the kitchen table, her tears falling onto a pile of unpaid bills and her heart breaking in ways no one would ever see. She began to pray more, not for herself, but for her son's heart. The following weeks were a blur of silence and small battles. Aiden stopped eating dinner with her, preferring takeout with Evelyn, and when Clara confronted her sister privately, Evelyn simply shrugged. "He's growing up, Clara. Don't suffocate him." But there was venom behind her smile, the kind that only envy could breed. One Saturday morning, Clara came home from work early and found Evelyn in the kitchen wearing Clara's apron, cooking pancakes while Aiden laughed nearby. "You don't have to do that," Clara said quietly, but Evelyn responded with a laugh, "Someone has to, since you're always gone." The remark stung, especially when Aiden didn't defend her. That night, Clara sat alone on the porch, staring at the empty streetlights, wondering where she had gone wrong. She thought love and sacrifice would be enough, but life was teaching her that sometimes love gets mistaken for control, and sacrifice looks invisible to those who've never had to give it. Her heart whispered warnings she didn't want to hear, that family can betray more deeply than enemies, and that sometimes the person you trust most can be the one who undoes you slowly. She didn't know that Evelyn's plan went further than emotional manipulation. Evelyn had found out Clara's small savings account through a joint family mailing address and convinced Aiden to access it for college fees. The boy, naive and desperate to prove himself, believed her when she said it was temporary, that she'd help him manage his mother's money better. By the time Clara discovered her account nearly emptied, it was too late, the funds had already been transferred, and both Evelyn and Aiden had vanished. The house was silent, the air cold with betrayal, as Clara stood staring at the computer screen showing a zero balance. Her knees gave out, and she sank to the floor, her chest heaving with disbelief and grief. She tried calling Aiden's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. For 2 days she didn't eat, didn't sleep, just sat by the window waiting for a call that never came. Neighbors noticed her absence at work, her boss called to check, but she said nothing. On the third day, a letter arrived in the mail, from Aiden. The handwriting was rushed, uneven. "Mom, please don't be mad. Aunt Evelyn said this was the only way I could start my new life. I'll pay you back, I promise. I just need time." Clara read it over and over until the ink smudged from her tears. It wasn't the money that broke her, it was the lie, the realization that the love she had given so freely had been turned into a weapon against her. She walked to the church that evening, sat in the back pew, and whispered, "God, don't let this be the end of my story." And somewhere in the silence, a voice in her heart said, "It's not." Weeks turned into months, and the little town that had always felt like home became a blur of empty days for Clara Monroe, who moved through her routines like a ghost wearing human skin, working, cleaning, breathing, but never really living. Word spread quietly that her sister and son had left together for California, chasing dreams that didn't include her, and every whisper in the diner felt like a knife twisted gently by gossip. Still, she showed up to work, poured coffee for strangers, smiled when she could, and collapsed each night into the silence of a house that no longer echoed with her boys' laughter. At first she hoped Aiden would call, but hope eventually turned into a slow acceptance that he might not, at least not soon. She packed away his childhood things, a baseball glove, a school photo, a handmade Mother's Day card with crooked hearts, and placed them in a box labeled "Someday." What she didn't know was that life in California was not the dream Aiden had imagined. Evelyn had used most of Clara's savings for herself, paying rent, buying clothes, pretending she was the successful aunt guiding her nephew to greatness, while Aiden worked odd jobs and struggled to keep up with school fees. His grades slipped, his energy drained, and slowly the shine of freedom dulled into guilt. He'd call Evelyn selfish, and she'd twist his words back at him, saying, "You'd still be scrubbing floors in that dead-end town if it weren't for me." Deep down, he began to see the truth, but pride held him captive, admitting he was wrong meant facing the mother he'd betrayed. Meanwhile, back in Larkspur town, Clara started volunteering at the local community center after church, helping other single mothers balance bills, fill out job forms, and find courage. She told herself that helping others might numb the ache of her own loss. Slowly people noticed the quiet strength that seemed to follow her, and though she never spoke of her pain, it became clear in the gentleness of her advice, in the way she listened like every story mattered. One evening, as autumn settled over the town and leaves painted the streets in orange and gold, she received a call from an unfamiliar number. "Mrs. Monroe?" a voice said softly. "This is Officer Davis from Los Angeles PD. We have your sister Evelyn in custody." The world froze. The officer explained that Evelyn had been arrested for credit card fraud and identity theft. Her record showed withdrawals from Clara's old bank account. "Your name appears as a victim," he said. "Would you like to press charges?" Clara's throat tightened. She whispered, "No, I just need to know if my son is okay." There was a pause, then, "He's not under arrest, ma'am, but he's been living at the same address." That night Clara prayed harder than she had in months, torn between anger and longing. The next morning she bought a bus ticket to California, leaving behind her diner job and her quiet home to find the boy she once held in her arms. The journey took 2 days, across dusty plains and glowing cities, every mile heavy with memories. When she arrived in Los Angeles, the noise and light of the city felt foreign, too big for someone who had lived her life in small spaces. She found the address in South Echo Park, a peeling apartment complex with broken mailboxes and graffiti-stained walls. Her heart pounded as she knocked on the door. When Aiden opened it, his eyes widened, his face pale with disbelief. "Mom," he whispered, voice cracking. Clara's hands trembled, not sure whether to hug him or slap him, but when she saw how thin he looked, the dark circles under his eyes, she simply stepped forward and pulled him into her arms. He didn't resist. For a long time neither spoke, just held on as years of pride dissolved into tears. Inside, the apartment was dim, cluttered with takeout boxes and unpaid bills. "Where's Evelyn?" Clara asked quietly. Aiden sank onto the couch and said, "Jail." Then the dam broke. He told her everything, the lies, the money, the manipulation, how Evelyn had used his guilt to control him until everything fell apart. Clara listened, her heart breaking and healing at once. When he finished, she said softly, "You were wrong, Aiden. But you're still my son." He wept then, more deeply than he had since childhood, and she let him. Over the next few days, she helped him pack, cleaned the small apartment, and used what little she had left to pay for his bus ticket home. "I can't go back there," he said at first, ashamed. "You can," she replied. "Redemption starts where you were broken." They returned to Larkspur town quietly. The neighbors whispered again, but Clara didn't care. She took him to the diner where she worked, introduced him to her coworkers, and together they started rebuilding. Aiden found part-time work at the local hardware store and began taking night classes at the community college. Every day he tried to earn back the trust he had shattered, and every night Clara prayed that forgiveness would keep growing between them like wildflowers after a storm. But life, as always, wasn't done testing them. One winter evening Clara collapsed at the diner from exhaustion and was taken to the hospital. The diagnosis was clear: heart failure brought on by years of overwork and stress. Aiden sat by her bed, terrified, holding her frail hand. "Don't you leave me now," he whispered. She smiled weakly and said, "I'm not going anywhere. I promised I'd see you become the man I raised you to be." Those words sank deep into his soul. For months he juggled work, studies, and caring for her, learning the meaning of real sacrifice, the same sacrifice she'd lived all his life. When spring returned, Clara grew stronger but knew her heart would never be the same. One afternoon they sat on the porch, the air smelling of rain, and she said, "You know, forgiveness isn't about forgetting, Aiden. It's about remembering without hate." He nodded, eyes wet. "I'm sorry, Mom." She touched his cheek gently. "I know. And that's enough." Somewhere in that quiet conversation, the weight between them lifted. Aiden began volunteering at the same community center where she once helped others, mentoring troubled teens, telling them about choices and consequences without ever mentioning his own name. Clara watched him with pride that felt like healing. When Evelyn's sentencing came, Clara attended the hearing not out of vengeance but closure. She stood before the judge and said, "I forgive her." The courtroom fell silent. Evelyn, in her orange jumpsuit, looked at her sister with disbelief, perhaps regret, perhaps envy of a peace she would never understand. After the trial, Clara walked out into the sunlight, feeling lighter than she had in years. Spring stretched into summer, painting Larkspur town in golds and greens, and Clara Monroe and her son Aidan finally settled into a rhythm that felt almost like peace. Mornings were spent tending the small garden behind their house, afternoons at the diner or community center, and evenings in quiet conversation over tea, where words no longer needed to explain old wounds because the silence itself had begun to heal them. Aidan continued working part-time at the hardware store, saving money for college, but he also took time to volunteer, teaching neighborhood kids about responsibility, integrity, and the consequences of selfish choices, and Clara watched him from her porch with a swelling heart, seeing in him the boy she had raised and the man he was slowly becoming, molded not just by hardship but by love that never wavered, even when betrayal had cut the deepest. Evelyn's trial had ended, and though she received a sentence for fraud and identity theft, Clara never visited her in jail. Instead, she chose to focus on life, forgiveness, and restoration, believing that vengeance could never fill the void of lost trust or wasted time. Aidan, though still carrying the shame of the choices he had made, began to understand the immeasurable value of family, sacrifice, and honesty, and as the days passed, he shared openly with Clara the guilt he had hidden, the resentment he had felt, and the lessons he had learned, and she listened with patience and quiet pride, knowing that his growth was the reward for all the heartbreak she had endured. Together they began repairing what had been broken. Clara helped him navigate financial responsibilities that Evelyn had jeopardized, taught him to manage the properties Robert had left, and showed him that wealth meant little without compassion, humility, and the ability to lift others as you rise. Neighborhood friends, once observers of Clara's quiet suffering, now marveled at the transformation. The mother who had been abandoned and betrayed had become a pillar of strength, guiding not only her son but other young adults who had lost their way, teaching them resilience through her lived example. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the streets glowed with amber light, Clara and Aidan walked along the familiar paths of their town, hands brushing occasionally, the weight of past betrayal softened by the years of hard work, love, and careful rebuilding. They paused at the park bench where Aidan had learned to ride his first bike, and Clara whispered stories of his childhood, of Robert's laughter, of small moments of joy that had survived the storms of deceit, and Aidan listened, eyes glistening, holding on to both memory and mother. In the evenings, they sometimes returned to the diner after closing, sitting together in quiet reflection, talking of dreams, of what had been lost, and of what could now be built anew. And though the scars of betrayal lingered, they no longer dictated the course of their lives. Clara knew, deep in her heart, that the greatest victory was not in reclaiming property or assets but in reclaiming love, trust, and dignity that no one could take away, even when a child had turned her back. She reminded Aidan constantly that life would continue to test them, that people may fail, and circumstances may deceive, but strength and kindness endure, and the choices one makes in response define the person you become. Years later, the Monroe home was filled with warmth once again. Aidan graduated, secured a stable job, and often returned to help at the community center, speaking to youth about resilience and family values, while Clara continued her quiet service, mentoring, and caring for neighbors, her heart full with the knowledge that love, patience, and forgiveness had restored her family in ways wealth could never buy. One late evening, sitting on the porch as stars flickered over Larkspur, Clara whispered softly, "We survived, my son, and our hearts are stronger because of it." Aidan, older now, held her hand, smiling through tears, understanding finally that betrayal had been only a chapter, not the story, and that the bond between mother and child, once fractured, had been mended with courage, truth, and the unwavering promise of love that even time and hardship could not destroy. And in that quiet, star-filled night, they both understood that life's deepest lessons were not in the loss, nor in revenge, nor in riches, but in standing tall after the fall, embracing forgiveness, and building a future where the heart, finally, led the way. Please like and subscribe my channel.